What's good, everybody? Thanks for tuning in to another episode of The Goats of Growth, formerly Over Quota. Still the same great... Oh, hold on. I screwed that up. All right, here we go. What's good, everybody? Thanks for tuning in to another episode of The Goats of Growth, formerly Over Quota. Still the same great interviews and guests, but with a more aspirational and inspirational name. Please subscribe. Either way, rate and review if you haven't already. And like always, the J. David Group, which is my company, is sponsoring this episode. We help recruit today's go-to-market teams that will lead the next generation of unicorns. Because like I always say, you can't build unicorns if you don't have the goats. Email me web@thejdavidgroup.com to learn more about how we can help you out. Now, this is a different episode than you're used to hearing from me because my guest today is Denice Sakakeeny, who is a corporate finance consultant and outsourced CFO that helps executives and investors remove impediments to organizational growth. We'll hear a little bit more about what she does specifically, but rather than interviewing a go-to-market leader, which is the main focus of this podcast, I wanted to interview someone who helps set and allocate budgets for two reasons. First, because in challenging economic times, there is a lot of fear and uncertainty about pending layoffs, who will be affected and when. So I'll ask Denice to help us understand how those decisions are made. And then second, I want to learn how CFOs make or help make purchasing decisions, especially when every dollar is heavily scrutinized. Denice, welcome to the Goats of Growth.
I'm so glad to be here, my friend. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. So how did I do there explaining what you do?
I think you did pretty well. I think, fundamentally what I do is I work at the intersection of people, process, and technology to solve problems for business executives. I think that pretty much summarizes it. And my background is that I kind of grew up in the B2B VC-backed software culture of Boston, Massachusetts. And I was started as an independent consultant in about 2011. And my practice, involves, being a CFO, raising capital, workouts, buying and selling companies. I also do a lot of corporate finance consulting where I consult to larger organizations such as large multinational operating nonprofits, global organizations, in areas of digital transformation, the highest and best use of assets, understanding economics and cost structures of products, and really kind of getting down and dirty in the field, of like organizational growth and field finance.
You articulated that so well. I'm thinking that maybe you could also be a go-to-market leader. I could start talking to you about, messaging and presentation because that was pretty tight.
Thanks. I think I learned it from like boardroom meetings where I had to explain how numbers related to activities. And I got, bit a number of times early on in my career that I wasn't able to do that. So what I realized is that it's not just about the numbers, it's about what happens to get to the numbers, right? So as a CFO or as a corporate finance kind of wonk, right? It's really not about the algebra. It's about what occurred to get to the slope of the line to change. And so I think that's where my interest and articulation and things like operations and go-to-market and processes and people really, really came into place as I was just tired of getting kicked in the butt every quarter by the board. So I just had to figure it out. Yeah.
Very cool. So let's start with what we mentioned before, which is problem solving and the impediments of growth, especially in these times, right? Where budgets being scrutinized, investment has dried up to some degree. Tell me, how do you, as your CFO, let's just say, and you're working with a company that has to start making decisions around layoffs, where does that begin? Just walk me through that process there.
Yeah. So I think I want to start a little bit further upstream, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
I want to start on what are the signals to organizational or financial distress, because although I have facilitated and personally laid off an untold number of people, that is really never the starting point for the decision, right? The starting point for the decision is, what are the economic circumstances that result in a decline in revenue, overconsumption of cash, and is it perceived or is it real, right? So those are kind of really the issues. And you can see those as they play out in the public sphere with, Facebook, Meta, Twitter, and any number of large tech companies, right? If you look at their financials, they're not suffering, right? Amazon too, right? They're not suffering. These companies are not broke, but yet there's a reason why they selectively have decided to lay people off, right? So I think that it's important to understand that when organizations think about terminating the employment of people, it may not be because they're like broke as a joke, right? It may be because the highest and best use of capital or the future expectation of revenue is declining, or something is not strategically of value anymore. And therefore, you just cut it, right? If something's not going to accrete value, you just don't do it anymore. If it's bad for you, just don't do it, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's part of it, and it is a pretty serious discussion.
When you talk about highest and best use, give me an example of what you mean by that when you say highest and best use of capital. Because, let's say a year from now, you weren't necessarily, or maybe you were, looking at it as closely as you are now, right? In other words, we didn't care about these layoffs, but we could always be looking at that same exact thing, right? Is this the highest and best use of capital? So as things start to get tougher, those I don't know what you want to call them, budget allocations start to get scrutinized more. So tell me a little bit about that.
100%. Yeah. So the CFOs spend a lot of time in the realm of the highest and best use of capital. And the highest and best use of capital is obviously dollars. It's also utilization of the company's assets, and it's people/labor hours, right? So if you think about everything that goes into creating something that's for sale, actually effectuating and distributing that sale, and then following up with client engagement, right? They either are dollars or labor, and all of those things could be considered company's asset, right? So when you think of like what the highest and best use of of one of these assets are, you have to really think about what the alternative cost is if you didn't spend your dollar there, right? So I just kind of want to simplify this a little bit, because I think a lot of the decisions that we make in our everyday financial lives is applicable to our business life, right? So think about this. Let's say you have a daughter and your daughter decided to take horse riding lessons. If your daughter decides she doesn't like horse riding lessons anymore, are you going to continue to pay for them?
No, of course not.
Right. Because you could take that money and do something that she really liked. Mm-hmm. And that would make her happy and that would make you happy, right? It's a pretty easy decision, right? Mm-hmm. On the face of it, right? So let's take one that's maybe, maybe not so straightforward, but also kind of like interesting, right? So you may own a house, and this house may need a number of repairs. And it may have a leaky roof, and you may want the color of your living room changed. What is your highest and best use of capital?
The living room. No, I'm just kidding. Depends on who's making that decision in my house.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely true for sure. Yeah.
Right. The roof. Right. Of course.
Yeah. And it's probably the roof, because if you don't fix it, it would cause more damage. Mm-hmm. Right. So when you think about how people use money and their time, it's very similar on a microeconomic level as it is for an organization, right? So a company example would be something like this. If you think about Amazon, I read in the news recently, I have no special news sources, right? It's just like out there for everybody to read, that some of the cuts that they made here in Boston were related to, those little things you used to, like Alexa, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like these little devices that you would talk into and have them do certain stuff for you, like to automate whatever, right? They made cuts to departments that did that sort of thing, right? Mm-hmm. So from a corporate finance perspective, or from a strategic perspective, or even from the perspective of highest and best use of capital, you have to think about why that is. Why would they cut somebody in that department? Because maybe that department isn't going to take up a larger portion of revenue in the future. Maybe that department hasn't seen any growth over time. Maybe they want to do an acquisition, so they don't need somebody actually doing certain roles. Interestingly enough, Amazon did not cut anybody in the well, they say they didn't cut anyone in distribution, right? So the people that are like coming to your house to drop off all your favorite toys, and your toilet paper and your sugar and whatever, they're not cutting those people. Right? Because the highest and best use of capital is to get people their stuff as quickly, as swiftly as possible as they approach the holiday season.
Talk to me about, you mentioned future revenue, how the highest and best use of capital can also affect future revenue, or something. I think exactly how you put it,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
tell me a little bit about that. Yeah.
So to me, that has a lot to do with strategy, right? So if you think about well-run organizations have, well, in my opinion anyway, they have kind of like a few simple guidelines that help them decide how they're going to make decisions. Okay. So to simplify it, basically is like, my company is Denice Sakakeeny and Associates LLC, and I work largely in the area of corporate finance. So my strategy is, providing excellence, support, and removing impediments to people that kind of like need bench expertise, right? If I were to go out and say Denice Sakakeeny and Associates is going to start selling apples, I could do that, but would it be strategically aligned? And so when I think about strategic alignment, what does that mean? It really means like the highest and best use of the assets that are already here. Do I have the expertise to grow apples? Can I buy them and sell them for profit? Will it interfere with other things that I'm already doing at Denice Sakakeeny and Associates LLC, right? So that is a very extreme example of a bad strategy, right? If you think about that on a corporate level, however, there are better examples of better strategy, but is still quite a nuanced decision, right? So for example, if a company that builds software for airplanes decides to build an airplane, is that a good or a bad decision?
That would be a bad decision.
Yeah, it may be a bad decision. Yeah. But the type of how you then take your capital and put it towards something like that future revenue stream, right? So when I say things like highest and best use of capital could go support the future, depending on what that future looks like from a strategic perspective, like what does the board want to do? What directions do they give? How many years into it do they still support that, right? Like just because you're having kind of like a bad time of it at the moment, or you're feeling pressured for capital, doesn't necessarily mean like you just bunker down, right? I mean, I want you to think of it from a perspective like of personal finance, right? If revenue is down for your family, you're not automatically eating ramen, right? You're just being very thoughtful about the future. You're like not planning a vacation. You're not going to buy another car. You maybe not, going to send your child to very expensive horse riding lessons if she's like kind of not happy there. And the decisions are really much like that on a corporate level also.
So in that example, a software company that's building airplanes, but it sounds to me like what you're saying is that it's okay for that software company to go build airplanes, right? Like hardware.
If they choose to, if that's their strategy.
Right. Because, you mentioned Amazon a couple of times, right? I mean, they started off by selling books. And then of course, now they're delivering food to delivering everything to my house, right? And so strategically, Jeff Bezos sort of had that vision from the beginning. And it was, and you're saying that as long as it's strategically aligned and also you're executing on that, then great, go ahead. But when it starts to get, when things get tight, let's say, and money is scarce, let's just say, then organizations start to look at this and say, you know what, that's not the highest and best use of our time, of our labor, to your point.
Yeah.
We need to cut that particular group. So in enterprise software, it might be, where a company decides that they thought they were going to go up market, let's just say, or they're going to start selling enterprise, and they're not getting the traction that they thought they were going to get. So then they reduce that headcount on enterprise and they focus more on their bread and butter, which might be mid-market or SMB. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's totally, fair representation of what I said. I think when it comes to like enterprise sales and software particularly, I want you to think about the cuts that would come before they actually started cutting market approaches, right?
Okay.
Like they would cut, well, how many times do we get together a year? Right. And maybe they wouldn't be so fancy. And maybe we would start to exclude some people. Right. So, we would have sales meetings, but maybe the finance person wouldn't come, or maybe you have one less person from HR show up or something like that. Right. So I think those cuts, keep positions open longer. Right. There's a whole thing that says, well, maybe people could keep positions open longer because then you don't know if they really need them to find out what kind of falls apart, which is very fair, I think, and rational approach to that a very good, solid manager might take, so I think that's definitely something too also. And I also feel that aside from like saying wholesale, we should not go to this market or we should not go up, right? They do other things like let's cut sales training and let's cut sales ops, let's tighten the quotas of people. Let's measure them more deeply. I think the other secret that it's no surprise that people do or leaders do in times of stress is they, increase quotas. They try to get more utilization out of the same dollar. So I think that's something that also occurs. And cutting people, when people lose their jobs, look, I've lost my job before. Before I consulted, I've lost a number of jobs, right? I mean, I'm not the only one. And deciding if someone should lose their job, especially at a company that's not massive, right? Like a mid-size, organization, or even a small organization, it's hard. And nobody likes to do it. And so they only do it when they think that the highest and best use of capital is elsewhere. You know what I mean? They're a lot more likely to slow down hiring, cut people in finance, cut HR, cut these non-essential things. I mean, if an organization is really truly cutting salespeople, there is either something wrong with that product line or something wrong with that particular market segment that they're going to. Because if you don't have salespeople, you don't get revenue. Right. So, you're cutting off one part of the organization that feeds the other part of the organization, so it's actually lots of finance chiefs are not in favor of that because it is proven that you have to spend in sales and marketing to get revenue. You have to. Like underspending in marketing is a number one signal for decline of future revenue, period.
Let me ask you this question as it pertains to strategic alignment and direction. Let's say, for instance, building that airplane, to play on that for a little bit, is strategically aligned with, the growth vision over the next year it might be. When does execution then get looked at, right? In other words, like it's strategic.
Yeah.
And that might go into what we're talking about in terms of looking at the sales and marketing team and saying, okay, this is the direction that we want to go in. We've committed to this for the next whatever, right? But it's not working. Like, tell me about that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, I've spent a fair number of hours / weeks / years in boardrooms, and boardrooms is really where strategy gets approved. I've been in corporate finance since 1996. So I've spent literally decades doing the everyday work of executing strategy. And someone might be like, well, you're a CFO, you grew up in corporate finance as an analyst and a controller and a director of finance and a CFO. Like, what do you know about, execution? Well, operating a finance team is a lot like operating a sales team. You must deliver on time. The end of the quarter matters. Specific dates of the year matter. Processes, internal controls, productivity, standards, they all matter. And they matter a lot to a CFO, much as they matter to like a VP of sales operations or chief revenue officer, right? The details matter. I probably need to beat a dead horse with my clients, but I have kind of like a thing that I like to say to them, whereas operational excellence is a strategic advantage. And it's because when the chips are down, if you're used to working at a high level and being, excellent, whatever that means to your organization, in my mind, it means effective and efficient, deployment of capital and execution. And effective and efficient are kind of different things. That takes practice. So for example, in a time of distress, you can't just decide to be excellent because you need to save money or because somebody has to do more than they did before, or you have to figure out how to do more with less. It takes practice and discipline to behave that way. So operational excellence is a competitive advantage because all companies will be in distress at one point or another of various degrees.
Right. And so in the case where you're looking at a strategic initiative to either go into a different market, build a new product, you've already committed to it. Really what you're looking at there is the execution on the, on on that particular team, let's just say. And if the execution isn't there, then that means that, well, let me ask you this just directly. In that case, is a company then looking at the leader and saying, they're not executing properly, let's remove the leader? Or is it, they're not executing properly, let's cut the bottom 5% of performers? Like
It depends. There are different strategies to that. There are organizations that do cut low performers, right? I mean, there's classic business school case of I think it's GE that just went through every year and just topped off, lopped the bottom 5 to 7% off every year, right? That is a little bit draconian. Some organizations I'm sure still do it. I have never worked for an organization that literally just said all these low performers just leave, right? Not to say that they don't exist, but in my experience, have never seen that before. I think what you're asking is a really interesting question. And I think if I had to put this in my own words, what you're asking is does non-performance fall on those who execute or those who pick strategy?
Right, exactly.
And that's a really hard thing to decide because they're usually two separate people. So a failed organization can execute really well a really terrible strategy and still fail. And an organization can have a really terrific strategy with very poor execution and still fail. And it is a very discerning eye. And often it is indeed left up to a very few kind of like group of executives that are kind of like disinterested in who's doing well and who's not doing well to just truly, truly solve the problem, right? So for example, if you're a head of sales and you're sitting in a board meeting, like I'm sure a lot of your listeners have, and the chairman of the board says, why aren't you meeting your numbers? Is the head of sales going to say, because I can't execute well, I have poor execution, or are they inclined to say the strategy is bad and therefore I can't sell ice to the Eskimos, right? Like, parties have to be a certain amount of disinterested and dispassionate to really parse that out because it is very deeply personal to people. It's basically saying like, you can't execute, you're not doing your job, right? It really hurts an employee to say something like that. It's a little less painful on a board level to be like, hey, board, you got your strategy wrong, right? Because they just have to go back and deal with the investors, which is a different everyday type of problem. Like, employees who aren't led to and held to the standards of excellence and the execution of their chain command, it's deeply personal for them and deeply personal for the leader that either doesn't have the skill set to lead in an excellent way, isn't supported by the manager to lead in an excellent way, right? So it is actually a really complex kind of like situation, of where is the failure? And sometimes there is no failure, right? Like I want you to think back to the beginning of COVID. We have a company here in Boston called Toast, right?
Yep.
Toast, people just weren't buying stuff. You know what that tells me? That tells me that part of their revenue model was that they have to take money off every ticket. That's what that told me. I don't really know, but that's my guess, right? Like restaurants, there's no throughput. So whatever percent they take as fee is not coming through. And so they cut a lot of people. But then if I recall correctly, they're doing quite fine these days. You know what I mean? So like, is that a bad strategy, a bad execution? Well, for them, it was neither, right? I mean, like people just stopped buying stuff, right. So it can be that the externalities of the world are just so strong. It absolutely distorts whatever terrific strategy you had at that moment, I want you to think also of, like Exxon and Mobil and the whole climate situation, right? So they didn't just wake up and think about neither the Saudis, right, or the royal family and their funds and stuff, right? Like they didn't just wake up one day and say, oh my goodness, like people are not going to buy petroleum anymore. They have had plans for decades, scenario planning and strategy that says, look, like what are we going to do if petroleum sales go down or dollar per barrel go down or demand for this, that, or the other thing go down, right? So they have had playbooks written. And I'm sure much like Toast had a playbook written that said, look, if sales decline for whatever reason that is unimaginable in the future, like this is what we're going to do. And maybe they didn't, but they ran that playbook, right? So, part of a good strategy is to imagine the unimaginable and have a playbook for that. So when it comes, you're not just like making it up on the fly. And so to get back to your original question, or one of your original questions, which was how do organizations make decisions about terminating people and what jobs to fill and what jobs not to fill? A lot of them are knee-jerk reaction. Like somebody's like, oh my goodness, I had no idea cash was going to be impacted this badly by this external situation. So Jay, your chief revenue officer, you need to cut 5% of costs or 10% of costs, right? And then you walk up to the CFO's office and you're like, I don't understand. Like, I have a quota to make and these people are important. And I'm just like, look, I don't have money. You should see what I just did to marketing, right? Like that is a very, very, very common scenario, but it is, it's hard because it indicates that whoever was doing the planning didn't anticipate and didn't let you as head of revenue know that you should scenario plan for that.
Right. And
like a surprise to you, right? Like, you never thought about it before because no one ever asked you to think about it before. So is that a flaw in strategy or, does the world just turn and people plan for it? It's hard to say because very few organizations in my experience, except ones that really focus on strategy, and not a lot of them do because they're so busy running a company, if that
Right.
makes any sense.
So then that CRO, to take that a step further, that CRO would then go to his team, so to speak, or her team, wherever it is, and say, okay, I need to get rid of X amount of people because they're costing us X amount of dollars. And I'm guessing maybe at that point, or maybe not, though, now that I think about it, because I talk to salespeople all the time who say, and I don't know, I have nothing to verify this, but they'll say, I was number 2 on the team. I was in the top 5, I was in the top 10, and they cut me. They said it wasn't personal, but
Yeah.
But I guess strategically, I would think that the CRO would go back to what we were talking about before, as far as being draconian, and say, okay, well, who are my bottom performers? Okay, those are the people that I'm going to cut if I have to cut anybody, right? I mean, I would imagine.
So first of all, it is a hard job to be an executive. And I don't mean like it's harder than other jobs, right? Like, it's not harder than other jobs, right? Like there are lots of jobs that are really, really difficult. Okay. An executive job is equally as difficult, right? So I am not wanting to come across as if like, woe is the executive, right? Because I do not feel that way, right? Executives get paid a premium to take on risk and think through complex situations and try to make decisions in the best interest of the company on an everyday basis and on a future basis, right? That is the role of an executive. So in my mind, that's part of, like a senior leader's job, right? Like what would happen if sales went down, right? Like people should be thinking about this, like not on an everyday basis, but they should just be kind of thinking about it, right? And they should have like a general idea, and they should be talking with their deputies about how would they structure a same level of delivery in a slightly down environment, right? And it's not that they think about it every day, and it's not that they put 5 minutes on their calendar to plan for it. But if you're an executive and you're responsible for delivering something under a variety of circumstances, like you just kind of got to tuck in the back of your head that like the money train is not going to be around all the time, right? And I want to take that back down to like this microeconomic everyday decision-making stuff, right? So, like in my household, we have retirement, we do like all normal kind of like executive people do, right? We save, we have working capital, we have checking accounts, we have retirement funds, we have investments, we have college tuition we have to pay. We have all of these things, right? And my husband and I have conversations, about if we want to save more money, what do we cut? And if my income or my husband's income would go down, like what would we cut? Right. We also have discussions of if we won the lottery, what do we do? Right. I mean, it's just good, it's good to have opposite stuff, but it's also good to really think through it so that we're not in times of stress. We're not like, oh my goodness, like, what are we going to do? How many less vacations are we going to take? Can I put off the tuition payment? Can I, pay my credit card in 45 days instead of 30 days? If I cut Netflix and all my streaming services, can I get a coffee every day? Like, these are everyday decisions that we make. And that everyday decision is the exact same for an executive, except it just happens to be like 100-fold, right? It's just 100-fold more complex because the amount of things that they could be asked to do or be required to do just takes a little bit more planning, right? So my thought process is that, executives plan for the up and the down in a variety of ways that suits them. It may not be formal, But nary a chief revenue officer, puts his or her head on the pillow and does not think about, what to do in times of stress proactively. And the ones that don't are the ones that are like, what am I supposed to do now? I never thought about this before. Like, what am I supposed to do? Well, that's why you get paid $350,000 because, maybe you should have thought about that, like for me, but I feel that way, not just about chief revenue officers or salespeople, right? I feel that way as a CFO, I'm forced to do it.
Yep.
Right. Because I'm the one that finds out first, right? I'm the one that I see the leading indicators, right? So we are always constantly talking with board members, talking with the CEO amongst ourselves. And we always have plans for our team about, what happens, because if things were to go sideways, bills still need to get paid, and revenue still needs to be earned and scored, and contracts need to be processed, and financial statements need to get done. And we still need to send compliance information to bankers and lawyers and tax accountants, right? So we have to do the same stuff, even if we have less people. So we, as CFOs of, kind of like the executives of the finance team, always are kind of in planning mode about what were to happen if we have to scale up or if we have to scale down.
Riveting. It really is. I'm like listening to you saying, I think a lot of people are going to get a lot out of this. You mentioned effective and efficient, and they're not the same. Unpack that for me.
Yeah. So it's really interesting because I literally just went through this exercise with a client that I have in DC. Mm-hmm. And I am working with them on understanding the economics of their digital publishing and their assets to try to help them do some digital transformation work and product and delivery. So, there's a business, I'm going to call him a business theorist named, Peter Drucker, which everybody probably knows about, right? And his definition of efficient use of capital is, how do you know what to do the right things? And effective use of capital is how much capital should be spent on doing these things. I'm paraphrasing that widely, right? But one is effective is basically like, how do you know what to invest in? And efficient is, how do you know how much to invest, right? And they're kind of two different things. And one's like strategy and one's like execution, you know what I mean? So they are kind of different,
I would imagine the second part of how much to invest is also, well, at least in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, well, what will be the return if I invest this much? What will be the return, and when will I get it back? Is
that's what a lot of people love. That is a straight up finance algorithm right there. Right. That is the straight up finance algorithm. And there are times when I've sat in board meetings and it's literally the only thing people ask. If I invest this money, right? Because I'm like, oh, guess what? We need more money, blah, 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 this and the other thing. Here's all my models. This is what we did. CEO comes in and, says, yes, Denice is right. We need this capital and we need this much money, blah, blah, blah. The very first thing the board members say, because, the board members are often the lead investors. Well, what are you going to do for this money?
Right.
Which is literally in their minds, they're running through like, are you going to spend it wisely enough so I can get money back after? If I give you money, are you de-risking my investment, or are you, up-risking my investment, right? That's like I can see it in their eyes. That's like the algorithm they're doing. You know what I mean? And so it is a thing. It is a very, very, very hard calculation to make if the person doing the math and the people that are like involved in these ROI aren't like specifically skilled in that kind of thing, because it is really easy to distort an ROI to someone's advantage.
Give me an example.
So, for example, I have a client and this client is terrific. So anything I say about this client is awesome. This client has an annual planning process where various people in the business across the organization request things from the IT team. Like, I want different feature function. I want this new system. I want to be able to, X, Y, or Z. And basically what they do is they present their case and their ROI and a little blurb on what they want to do. And they present some information and a little budget, right? Because obviously you need a budget to figure out what the ROI is, okay? And obviously they understand that the organization is predisposed to selecting things with a high ROI to prioritize. So when, the first passes, a financial analyst went through and indexed all these things and looked at all the stuff and created a spreadsheet and then obviously sorted it from highest ROI to lowest RSI. Well, of course, there were some people that said there is no ROI because it just transcends value. Like, remember back in the old marketing days where it's like, oh, I don't have to measure anything. Like, it's about brand. Brand can't be measured. I'm talking about, back in the 90s and pre, where it was like, I just need money. Like, there's brand reputation. It can't be measured. And guess what? Come to find out, everything can be measured, right? So
Right.
It's like that, right? It transcends value. So I can't give it an ROI. It transcends value. So you're like, okay, that makes sense. Sort of. I get it. Like, I'm not disagreeing with you that some things can't be measured effectively or efficiently, or some things just need to be done even without measurement, right? But when you look at some of the calculations of the people that actually did the ROI calculation, and to their credit, they put time and effort into doing it. They didn't just say it's so important, it transcends the ROI. A lot of things of what they included was, like fixed costs, right? Fixed costs don't really change no matter what you do. So they're like, oh, we'll save this percent of this whatever if we do this, right? But the reality is the organization still has to spend that money, right? Whether that is redeployed to something else or whether it's something, it's not a variable cost, right? So to say basically, it's basically like where you put pressure on it over here and the water squirts out over here, like those little water balloons that the kids have, like you had them as a kid where like you squeeze this and the water goes over here and you squeeze this and water goes over here. And when you squeeze both sides, it gets really tight in the middle. It's like that, right? It's like, oh, well, I will save this much money, but now there's bloat on this side of the organization and that's their problem, right? But the ROI on this side looks really good and really tight, right? That's like not a super terrific ROI calculation because you're not really saving anything and you're not really improving anything, right? You're just kind of like moving the water from one side to the other. You know what I mean? And so those ROI calculations I saw, not all too infrequently on this particular client's requests, right? And it's not that they did it wrong, right? The people that did it with really good intention. They're smart. They love their jobs. They've been super hardworking. They participated in a process. But the reality is that outcome, that math doesn't get the answer that is needed, right? That is a false god. It is no less false than somebody saying, look, this needs to get done and it doesn't have an ROI, right? I just want you to think if your wife came home to you the other day and she said, hey, Jay, the lock's broken on the front door. We need to fix the lock. And you said, babe, what's the ROI? I'm gonna be like, what are you talking about? What's the ROI? Like, the lock's broken. Like, just go fix the door, dude. Like, what are you talking about? Right? It's like that a little bit, right? So you have the people that really participate in the process for the ROI to really kind of drive home and really spend time thinking about it, but their pieces are just not so technically correct. And then you have the people that are just like, fix the broken lock, right? And so how do you know what is the right answer? If you strictly do it on ROI without the kind of technical expertise or the idea that the ROI is tied to strategy in some way, much like I probably could make money selling apples. I could probably figure out a way to buy them wholesale and arbitrage them, like I probably could make like a penny an apple, but is that really good or bad? You know what I mean? Like, it's hard to say, right? So when I think of ROI, yeah, I'm a big fan of ROI, but I'm also a big fan of like keeping it real, right? Like, only really large organizations or really technically apt organizations do ROIs well. And so to think that it's like that should be the final determinant of the way capital is spent, to me, is like a false god, and I definitely support data-driven decision making. I don't support like performative like data, right? Like, we just have a data and that's what we're going to do. And we're not going to look if it's, on either side of these equations, right?
I feel like I could talk to you for another 2 hours because I have a different side of the equation that I want to talk to you about for the next 10 minutes or so, which is that on the other side, and maybe I'd say the more optimistic side, is that companies right now, at least I know my clients are, I know we are, frankly, at the J. David Group, forecasting and planning for 2023 to make sure that we achieve the goals that we want to achieve and companies want to achieve as well. And candidly, we're getting calls from companies that are urgently hiring, right? And because they need to hit their numbers in 2023. So where do you get involved with that in terms of headcount planning, right? To say, okay, we need 10 salespeople by the end of Q1, or like, what is that?
Yeah.
What
It's,
decision? What goes into that?
it's so tricky because I once worked for a CEO that said to me, Denise, like planning is like dreaming on paper. And he was not wrong. I was totally offended at the time that he did that, right? Because I was just like, what are you talking about? Like, I just killed myself over these financial models. Like, my team has been drowning. Like, what are you telling me? Like, you're just like kind of happy I did it. It's like, I felt very dismissive to me, but the reality is that he's right. And over the years, maybe like the 12 or 15 or so years since that occurred, he's absolutely correct, right? Like, making a plan is like a good thing to do because it just makes you think things out. But what's more important is to measure if what you said in your plan actually came out to be true, because that helps you understand if the plan is worth a darn. Right? So how does that relate to planning for sales teams? Most sales teams that I know of are built on what I would consider to be economic models. So for example, you have 4 sales people. They have a sales ops person, they have a coordinator, they have a team lead, they have a technical salesperson, they have a pod of salespeople, right? There's like a pod. And each director manages so many pods. What is the output of that pod? And does it pay for itself? And when? Okay, that's a plan, right? Like those are the things we as CFOs kind of like opine about, right? And it's not that we make it up, right? Like at different levels of different types of organizations will make up their own stuff, right? Like, it doesn't live with the CFO to design this economic model, right? But it lives with the CFO to make sure that it works. Because if it doesn't work, we're kind of forking out cash to fill the gap, right? So that's the CFO's interest. It's not necessarily, there's some about it, how standard is it compared to others? Is there proven? Does it work? What's the risk? Like there's some like basic executive level thinking about that, but we by and large do not design how things are going to be sold, right? But so if we have a plan, but the plan may not be working or maybe taking longer, right? We would measure that over time. So how do we decide who to hire and when? All has to do with what is the economic model, how many people and in what positions do we need to yield what amount of revenue, and how much capital do we have to float the organization to get that pod up to speed or to get the output of that pod, right? And so a knee-jerk reaction would be like, revenue is slow. This pod is perhaps underperforming, so let's cut it. Or let's slow the growth of the pods, right? Or let's not bring on as many pods this quarter, or let's bring them closer together even so that we can benefit from having less training resources over time, right? So there are different ways to kind of alter that algorithm, but basically it has to do with, as you point out, return on investment, right? If I, as a CFO, have an economic model that says I'm going to hire 7 people into a pod and it's going to effectuate this much contribution to the bottom line at maturity, I got to measure that. Because if it's not working, then I have to figure out what to do because I'm putting more money into keeping these people alive than they are into giving me money to pay other people in the company. Do you see what I mean by that? So it has to do with the economic model of the organization, planning, and measuring.
I would imagine that part of the economics of the organization would have to do with the goal that, or the number that, say, the CEO has promised the board, right? In terms of this is what we're going to grow by 25%, or we're going to double every year for the next whatever years, right? And so if a company has raised money and they need to double by the end of 2023, is it not just as simple as, well, we need to find $5 million for 2023. In order to do that, we're going to need, to your point, another pod. That pod will produce whatever. And as a result of that, that means we need 5 more people in Q1 or whatever it is.
Yeah. That is the algorithm in the boardroom meetings, right? Like I have seen, well, let me back up a minute. venture-backed and other privately held companies historically for the last maybe 15 years or so, maybe even more, and there's a lot of this in the public press and in the business press to support this, have had top line revenue growth at all cost. So investors have put money into businesses that had a negative ROI because they had a good top line growth. And the strategy behind that, frankly, is that these companies will sell, they will exit. There will be a forced event by which the cost infrastructure needs to get cut, but the revenue still stays high, right? That's the philosophy behind it, right? So the companies that, and they either have a forcing function by they go public and they have to like then suddenly behave a certain way, or they get acquired and the synergy between the acquirer and the company itself, you still have this like top line revenue, but it can deliver the revenue and maintain the revenue at a much lower cost base, right? That's been the hypothesis, okay? And that's been the algorithm and in the head of every investor historically for the last 15 years. That is now changing. Why is that changing? Because capital is now expensive. People that fund privately held companies rely on their wealth of the people that contribute money to funds. They rely on their own personal wealth. And in the case of private equity, they rely on debt. Now, debt has become vastly more expensive. All our portfolios are down. And people are getting a little bit more skittish about this kind of speculative type of money on the personal level, but also on the corporate institutional level. And this is what makes the venture capital world go round. Okay. That is why people are dialing back capital. And that is why the whole concept of growth at all cost is dying. So now investors are saying, okay, well, especially investors in existing companies, I have capital. I want it to give me a return, but I have less capital than I had before, but I don't want to make less of a return, right? So what am I going to do? I'm going to make people perform on the first dollar basis, right? Instead of me giving you $100 million to perform, I'm going to give you like $50 million and I want you to perform, right? That's a different ecosystem, right? Like that math is a little bit different on the CEO side and the CRO side about how to deliver that. And that's what we're experiencing now. And I think a lot of that is people are just cutting and pulling back and trying to figure out how to preserve their capital. And it's particularly difficult for sales organizations because if you didn't precede this and you haven't been in an environment where it's growth at all costs, it may feel like personal and weird to you.
That goes back to what you were saying earlier about contingency and strategic planning, right? In terms of what happens if the money dries up, as an example. What will this organization look like, and what strategic decisions that we need to make if, for instance, growth at all costs stops and it's profit first, right? Because that's a completely different strategic direction that a company needs to.
100%. Maybe I would say not growth at all. I like the way you phrase it, growth at all costs and profit first. I would not say profit first. I would say not hemorrhaging capital for the sake of gaining revenue.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That's the way I would phrase it, because I don't think anyone expects, well, maybe people expect them to be profitable, but the reality is that if you've been running a company for so long, I mean, we have like decades of CEOs we have CEOs out there who for the last 15 years have been trained to focus only on top line growth and not bottom line at all. Mm-hmm. So unless you've been around the block and seen this before, like you predate this era, or you have a very astute understanding of what's being asked of you, it's really, really, really hard because the all you can eat buffet days are over because of the capital constraint nature, right? So yeah, people are hiring. Why are they hiring? Because you need salespeople to do stuff.
Right.
Period. Okay. Sales to do stuff, right? Like just like I need clients to pay my son's tuition. Okay. It's just a reality of life, right? Like that's it. It's that easy. It's a math problem, right? So sometimes companies will say, okay, well, I'm going to cut in the back office area, or I'm going to cut these like non-essential things, but sales is relatively essential. So how am I going to make them more efficient? Are they effectively in the right markets? Are they organized? Do they have the best chance of doing what they're supposed to do? Do we have to go up market, down market? Can we, sell a pen and to this pen? Can we sell them this instead? And how many people do we need to do that? Or maybe we should go into a different country, or, so you see a lot of creativity in that regard because you need sales. Like you cannot always be selling, right? You have to sell. So if you have less salespeople, you're going to sell less. So I don't see a lot of companies cutting frontline salespeople. Like I'm going to talk to you and end of this conversation, you're going to give me money, right? Like companies are only stopping that if those channels have not proved to be worthwhile, right? Like, all these organizations that are cutting their advertising from Twitter, they're not cutting their advertising from Twitter and then going to go post losses because Twitter advertising got cut. Right. They're going to cut Twitter and then go spend someplace else, right? They're not going to suffer their bottom line because they had to make a decision about deployment of capital, right? So they're going to cut in a environment that they felt was reputationally damaging and go reinvest that money someplace else. Just like a company that's going to cut a frontline salesperson is going to take that money and they're going to put that into something that yields something better, right? The highest and best use of capital, because you have to have salespeople. You have to sell stuff.
I think maybe I'll take that clip and just use it as an advertisement for the J. David Group for, people that are, in business at all, because that's what we do, right? Help them find salespeople.
Yeah.
So many more questions to ask you, but let me just ask you this one question before we get to the rapid fire 5.
Oh, I'm so excited about rapid fire 5. And I also have to tell you, congratulations on your 100th podcast.
Oh, you saw that. Thank you.
I saw that.
Thank you. Yeah. I don't know. This one might be 105, 106, something like that. So yeah, for sure. But thank you for that. So what the question I have, which has just been burning from the moment you mentioned it, which is that sales leaders or companies, just generally speaking, will increase quotas during, times where the, things start to slow down, economic challenges, you need more money. The question I have for you is that, like, strategically, that just doesn't seem to make, I guess from an execution perspective, I'll say it doesn't seem to compute, right? In other words, if you give somebody $1 million quota and now they have a 1.25 or $1.5 million quota with the same territory, the same customer base, how does that, what is that? Like, where does that come from? And is the expectation, what is the expectation that they'll just ask their reps to work harder or work more? Like, is that really what it is? Or?
Well, I want to couch it this way, right? It is human nature to have let me phrase this properly. It is human nature to have a suboptimal response to a complex problem, right? Because we're not machines, right? So when we think about a complex problem, like, there's not enough money to do everything that we want to do for whatever reason, right? So we do less things or we do more with the same amount of money, right? Those are the options that we have, right? There aren't a lot, like, when you think of a situation like that, that's a math problem. Like, as a CFO, that's an algebra problem, right? Like, I have a client right now where, I talk to the executive committee and I'm like, look, you want to do more things than you have money for. That's it, right? So you can take your dollar and do more with it through a variety of different ways, find lower cost resources, make people more productive, reorganize the organization to get them to workflow a little bit differently so you get more in, or you just do less. Okay. When you think about those two options, the raising quota falls into the first category of the same dollar, you pay the same person the same amount of money, but you just want them to do more, right? And it's not necessarily a rational decision. And I think lots of salespeople are like, that's the dumbest decision I ever heard. How am I going to get people to do more? Right? It's hard to do. Mm-hmm. I think, though, that the reality is that this plays out every day in this audience. I don't think that there's a salesperson that would listen to this podcast that would say, oh, no, actually, I'm asked to do less.
Right. But by the way, like, in good economic times or bad economic times, the quotas are being raised anyways, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the thing, right? And I think it has to do with, you have two tools, right? You have a tool of, do you do more with the same dollar, or do you do less? Or do you take that dollar and do something different that's going to yield you a different result, right? So I think in that regard, it comes from that place, right? As a CFO, I will tell you that has happened to me many times in my career when I worked in venture-backed, software, and the board would say, look, you don't have any more money, where you have to figure out what to do in times of stress. And we go through the whole organization. And the very last thing that we do is we say, I think maybe sales should sell more. And the sales team, they hate it.
Right.
But you know what? I just got my whole finance team cut and they have to do more, right? Like I don't have 3 AP clerks now, I have 2 and they have to do more, right? But if an AP person complains, like it's like a echo chamber, right? Nobody cares, right? But if a salesperson complains, lots of people care, right? Because they get the revenue in, right? So I think it's a very kind of sensitive topic. Whether it works well or not work well is hard to say. To your point, they're always asked to do more year over year anyway. And what's the fairness or validity of that? I don't have an answer, but I would be lying to you if I told you that that does not happen, because it does happen a lot.
Yeah, I think what comes to my mind, frankly, is tools and technology, which is a whole different. I mean, we have to do a part 2, Denice. I'm going to make you right
Oh,
here.
please.
I was going to say, you heard it. I have witnesses. People that listen to this podcast know that Denice Sakakeeny just agreed to do a second episode, and frankly, there's probably even a third one because we didn't even get to most of the stuff that I wanted to get to. But this has been rich and riveting. So, you ready for the rapid fire 5?
Yes. And I want to let you know that I did not plan for this. So it's just going to be like,
that's right.
All right, let's do it.
Yes. And for the audience, Denice and I have known each other for quite some time now. Both started off professionally, turned into personally. We are friends now. And I will say that part of that reason why she doesn't have the rapid fire 5 is because I took a little bit of advantage of the familiarity, I guess, and said, you know what, she doesn't need these. I'm just gonna ask her right now on the podcast. So here we go.
That's all right. If she messes it up, she won't hate me. That's what you're thinking.
Yeah, pretty much. Right.
All right, let's do it.
Right, here we go. Very simple ones though, actually.
Yeah.
What motivates you?
Kindness to people, fairness, trying to be an agent for equality. I don't like to see people in distress or suffer. So the work that I do, I really get a lot of joy and motivation out of streamlining, simplifying, solving problems for the everyday people.
Name a big goal you have right now, and when would you like to accomplish it?
I would like to move out of New England because I've lived here my entire life, all my 48 years. And I would like to move someplace with really, really stellar weather. And I would like to accomplish it when my son has graduated from college and is like settled in his adult life, sometime in his like mid-20s.
Very good. What's the most preferred way to learn information and to stay sharp?
I am a voracious consumer of the written word. I probably read 3 or 4 newspapers a day. And I love to talk with all kinds of people. I just love to interact with people and hear their stories and think about what's important to them and hear them talk about their experiences. And that really helps put a lot of things in context, both professionally and personally.
How many hours of sleep do you average per night?
I am an insomniac. I am a complete insomniac. So the answer to this question is not based on some view of the world that people should get less sleep, because I personally would like to get more sleep, but I probably get 6 hours of sleep a night, which is not as much as I need.
I'm right there with you. 5 to 6 for me, for the same reason, by the way.
Yeah.
What's your favorite thing to do when you aren't working?
My favorite thing to do when I'm not working. Oh, there's so many. I really love my family. And by that, I mean my husband and my son and my English Mastiff dog, Sarasota. I love my extended family, my parents and my aunties and my husband's children and parents. So I love to spend time with them and think about how to be in service to them. But my real true passion is travel. And I love to see the world. I've never met an airplane I didn't like. I never met a bus stop I didn't like. I never met a language that I couldn't speak that I didn't like. I never met street food that, I wouldn't eat more than once, although that's not entirely true. But I love to experience things with the people that I love that are like not every day. That's like if I ever get to retire, I will just be a nomad without a phone or a laptop, and I'll be on the streets of, Spain somewhere, or, hanging out with my husband.
I'll try to find you some way. I thought somehow I was gonna. I thought dinner with me and my wife was going to make that list, but that's okay. Maybe
Just
another.
think, I saved you from COVID.
There you go. That is true. That is true. One more question, very simply. How can folks reach out to you to say thank you, ask you some questions I didn't ask, or perhaps maybe who are looking for a corporate finance executive or
Yeah. Sure. So you can find me on LinkedIn, Denice Sakakeeny. I also have a website, dsakakeeny.com, which is D, S as in Sam, N as in Nancy, Y.com. And you can always email me at Denice, DENICE at dsakakeeny.com. And just to let your readers know, I have plenty of clients, although I love to work. But the reality is I really like to help people. And it's not that I like to help people because I'm like a kind-hearted, loving person, is that I find business challenges really intellectually interesting to me. And I really like the fact that the more people I interact with and the more challenges I try to work through, like the better I get at my job, because I get exposed to a wider variety of things. So although business is nice, people are more important to me than that. So I just kind of want to make sure that everybody knows that there's no hard sell here for me. Like, I love you, and I'm proud to be on the show.
And I'm sure everybody will find this episode intellectually stimulating, because I know I did, and I'm sure everybody will as well. Denice Sakakeeny, thank you for joining the Voice of Growth.
Thank you for having me.
Goodbye, everybody. I'm cueing the music.